The first Spiral Out Zoom podcast. So this should be entertaining. So today we're going to discuss what obviously the current situation and what happens with a lot of people's training and having to train for most people, somewhat of a limited scenario. And I'm sure I can speak to myself. I have clients that basically have no equipment. I have clients that have 2 weights, 1 dumbbell and 1 kettlebell. I have clients that have 1 barbell with limited selection of weights and a couple medicine balls. And I have clients all the way up to they own a gym so they can train at it, right? I'm sure you guys probably have similar situations.
Yep, for sure. People who have weights at a gym, people who have weights in their apartment, their high-rise apartment on top of neighbors.
Some who have nothing at all.
Yeah. Anyway, so I guess what we really want to talk about is people and the way that they would, or the way that we would design the training for our clients that are basically really limited in their training options. So they no longer have a gym with ski ergs, rowers, air bikes, boxes, pull-up bars, rings, ropes, all selections of dumbbells, all selections of kettlebells, a full selection of barbells, and all kinds of space, GHD, everything. So you go from that scenario to you have your basement and basically, let's just say a pair of dumbbells. That's probably a pretty common scenario. So what's one of the main things that we wanted to discuss first with part 1 of the podcast being talking about basically the current environment of a limited training environment or a limited training, equipment environment. Like what's one of the first things we would want to mention about that and things to consider when you're going to try to, I guess we might want to pick an athlete or pick someone, maybe just keep someone in mind or keep maybe 2 people in mind. Maybe like someone who's a really high-end competitor, doesn't matter male or female, so they can perform all the movements in the sport of CrossFit, and they can do it really well, and they're really strong, and they're really experienced, versus someone who is kind of not a beginner level, maybe an intermediate level performer. So they're probably limited in their upper body strength. They can't really perform all the gymnastic movements. They need to get way better at squatting, deadlifting, snatch, clean, and jerk. They're probably not, their work capacity is not great enough. So maybe we just keep those 2, I guess, generic ideas in mind. So what's one of the main considerations that I guess would be shared by both of those people as they move into this scenario of training in their basement with very limited equipment?
Well, you have a high likelihood of overusing certain movement patterns for sure, right? And I think given that scenario, if it is just a pair of dumbbells
down there, why would that occur? Oh, Scott's pissed.
If they only have access to, say, a pair of dumbbells, then obviously the things that they're able to do are extremely limited. But things that are easy to do when you have limited equipment is a lot of like knee flexion type stuff. Whether it's squatting, lunging, jump squats, walking lunges, stuff like that doesn't require a lot of equipment. It's really easy to overdo those movement patterns and less easy to incorporate like hinging type movements, pressing type movements, pulling type movements. So then you tend to kind of just your workouts kind of steer towards what direction, and what's easiest to accomplish given your limited access to equipment.
So like if you just think about that idea of it's easy to overload knee flexion, and it's easy, which is okay, it's good, because then if you no longer have the ability to squat, or if you do front squat, back squat, deadlift at loads approaching your maximum, you want to try to find ways to create or not create, try to maintain muscular function, both in strength, power, endurance, as best you can in a basically very low load environment, right? But what usually happens with that is, like you said, is repetitions just get multiplied. And one of the downsides of that is at home with low loads, it is harder to create, in my opinion, it'd be harder to create, I guess, like a similar type of training environment or to similar type of training stimulus to the posterior aspect of the legs, so the calves, hamstring, glutes, back, as you could do for the anterior aspect, right? Just with a pair of dumbbells, like you really do need load for the lower back to train that. Whereas like you can do lots of pistols if you're capable of doing that without creating any problems. You can change tempos, and even if you just add a little bit of load, you might be able to adequately train the quadriceps to at least maintain some strength, right? And you can do different jumping variations that are acceptable for you, which we can probably talk about later. But what do you actually do? What can you actually do for the lower back with when there's no load or very low load, right? It's just hard. And just and then obviously trying to train to balance out a program that's all knee flexion at home. That's a hard part too.
Considering that the low back is best employed when we start talking about lifting in an isometric fashion, like it's not supposed to move when you're loading it up, and anything that you're doing at home with very low weight and high repetitions is going to include some back flexion extension, which is good, but it's not training it the same way you're going to when you have a heavy load.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you manage to sneak like a 150-pound sandbag from the gym that you worked out at, and then like, okay, now you can do some stuff. But with those dumbbells, you're training it very differently.
Yeah, so obviously with that, just on that topic of loading, so if you're unable to use the same amount of loading, you're not going to be able to create the same amount of mechanical tension. So your ability to likely maintain muscle mass will be hard. It's going to be hard to do that if you're used to maintaining a muscle mass that you're at with high loads, because that's how you're going to get there. Creating tension, adding load, continue. When you go to a scenario where you're now having to do sets of 20 to get, what would be called 5 effective reps, or sets of 30 to get 5 effective reps. You had 25 reps before that were not being used, so to speak, to maintain that muscle mass, right? So that you're just adding to knee flexion by doing that. And it's a complicated, it's just a really challenging scenario. And it's like I was mentioning last week, I personally believe that as you reduce the options individuals have to use, the person designing the training has to be more and more competent, because it is much more, it's easier to create more problems with less options. You agree with that?
Yeah.
Or just to think about that, because obviously, if you have someone who doesn't know how to manage loading, and you have all the options available to you, you can create lots of problems. But if you have someone who doesn't, if basically as a coach, if you're inexperienced with, I guess if you're new, if you're inexperienced with managing training variables, it's really easy to overdo things when you're not trying to I guess almost balance all these different variables at once. Like how many reps of squats did you do? How much work specifically was done on the quadriceps? How much work was done, like, I guess, at the glutes? Like how much, and what movements focus on what? And then how do you get similar training effects, but do it a different way, so it's not just repetitive stuff over and over? So again, when you only have a pair of dumbbells, to me, I would say that would be challenging for someone who's new to coaching.
Yeah, it's really easy to kind of just throw things together haphazardly to create, variety and novel training situations, but to do it with some sort of intent in mind, and like you said, to create balance, it takes an incredible amount of brain power to do that. And we talked about that last time we spoke last week about, just how how much effort and mental effort it takes to sit down and write programs for people week after week that have those limited training scenarios, right? It's incredibly challenging to do it and to do it well.
And how about trying to remember all the different equipment people have?
That's the worst. There's a list
Impossible.
specific to that person.
I'm always thinking about it. I'm like,
yeah.
okay, what? I can't remember now.
Yeah.
It's like, no, Michael, sorry, I only have a 37.5-pound dumbbell, not a 35.
Exactly.
Like, oh, sorry.
It's a 30 kg kettlebell, not a 30-pound dumbbell. I'm like, gosh.
Yeah, and then kind of along with that, it's okay. So go back to the start. People go from having full-on training to now they're training in their basement. So one of the main things that's going to occur, or should probably occur with your training, is initially your training volume should go down, right? That we would kind of agree on that, based on the you're going to have less training options. So if you're used to having a 90-minute, 2-hour training session, you probably should go down to a 30, 45-minute training session initially, maybe, because you have less options available to you. And you don't want to just fill that time with things because you think your training session is supposed to be that long. Because your ability to train different elements of fitness is vastly diminished now. So you have to knowingly accept initially that you should be probably doing a little bit less training if you're in this really, really restricted training scenario. What do you think?
Yep. And I've actually had clients reach out to me and say, the workouts are really short. Like, can I double these up? And it's like, it has to be that way. And it has to be that way for those reasons that you just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
And, in a couple of weeks or a few weeks down the road, maybe we can look at lengthening them out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you have access to more equipment in a couple of weeks and we can kind of, add some more things in without, kind of compounding on what we've already programmed for that day, without any ill effects. But for right now, it has to be this way. And these are the reasons why. And just having that conversation with clients is really important, and kind of letting them, because they don't understand, right? A lot of those clients, they're just like, all of a sudden they see a drastic decrease in the workload and they're like, now what do I do?
Even like having something as simple as a nice day to work with so people can go running changes dramatically how much time they can spend training that day. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have that access to it, it's the goal of the training session isn't just to fill time. The goal of the training session is to achieve a training effect, and adding in running to something can change how much work volume you can do that day is. Mm-hmm. Like it's the same thing as if you had a rower. If you had access to a rower, boom, completely different game. But if you're very limited, the amount of time you can train is limited. It has to be.
Again, the one asterisk being with running being the important modality there, in that, like, if someone just gets a bike and they haven't biked in a month, 2 months, they can hop on and do 30 minutes of intervals designed for you and be fine. If someone hasn't run in a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, unless they have this background of being really good at running, structurally they're designed well for it, they have lots of experience, their training volume is really low with running initially. And it would still go from, if they're spending 3, 4, 5 hours a week on ergs, they're not replacing that with running at all. They're going to replace it with 1 hour in the first week, maybe, and then maybe 90 minutes in week 2. So the training volume will be up here for that, and then COVID comes and it goes down here, and then you try to find a way to make it go back up in a productive way. Like Jay was saying, you want to try to make it not just be filler, you want it to be effective. But psychologically that's challenging for people to go, okay, my workout is now 40 minutes. Why? You're like, well, what else are we going to do? Are we just going to keep adding repetitions in for some reason? I just always worry about, like, what are we doing? We're just wasting time. Not wasting time. We're just throwing out useless reps, right? That's the way I would think of it. So the volume is down. So likely you're going to lose some form of strength in lots of different ways. Likely you'll lose some muscle mass, which is, again, that's kind of, I guess, there's not really much you can do with that. You have to do your best to try to maintain things as best you can. with effective designs and adjusting tempos and reps as needed and being creative with movements that are going to be appropriate. The one thing that we will just quickly, one of us can touch on, and we can all chime in on it, which we were talking about in the before we started recording, about if people don't have a lot of load, so they can't do snatching, clean and jerk, squatting, good option for them to do if it's appropriate for them is some form of plyometrics. But how do you start? Like, where do you start with that? So if someone just goes, yeah, I'm used to doing snatch, clean and jerk, and then you go, okay, do you ever do like bounding? Do you ever do vertical jumps or any of that stuff? And they go, no. Okay, so where do you start with that person, assuming they're really strong? Like obviously the idea is that you're going to try to mimic weightlifting as best you can without weights. So jumping is a good idea for that, to try to maintain some form of power and speed through the legs. So what's a starting point for some people? And let's take someone who's like, again, that intermediate level person first. So they haven't done it. Should they just start doing broad jump EMOMs?
Yeah, no, like that's, you have to start with the progression of mechanics on how to land, and doing something as simple as jumping and landing and sticking the landing on the spot, or jumping down from the first stair of your staircase and sticking the landing so that you're in control of it. Like that's a massive skill that a lot of us will take for granted. But if you have zero experience with it, like, it's hard. It's very tough. You don't know how to control your body. You start moving in different directions, loading the knee improperly, etc. So that's a perfect place to start.
Yeah, so maybe you do that on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of your workouts now for like maybe a total of, and this is how you would do it. You would count the touches. So you do, okay, we do 25 total lands on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Totally good. Okay, now next week you can either progress the movement or you can progress the repetitions. So you might do the same amount of reps, maybe from the second stair, who knows? And go, okay, now we're going to do reps.
If someone's an intermediate athlete, they'll progress through it relatively quickly.
Yeah.
Like but it's not something that you should skip, even if you are an intermediate athlete. There's no way to skip it. Otherwise, if you do, then you're opening yourself up to a whole lot of
the big thing we're getting at is for clients. It's like some clients that may go rogue and want to start adding stuff in. It's the common issue of injury mechanisms where there's too much loading too fast, or there's too much work volume too soon. And you didn't give the tissues time to adapt to the stimulus you were trying to place on them. So you want to get good in a marathon, you don't just go run the distance, because your body is not able to withstand the workload. You have to train up to that. In a similar line of thinking with regards to jumping, you may want to be able to train broad jumps and perform like 30 or 40 reps in a session. That seems like a lot, but you may think that you want to do that, or you may want to do like bounding drills to maintain your leg power as best you can. Okay, good. But you're at the starting point. You have to start from part zero and move up. And that goes with all this stuff. Like the training principles don't die because you're in your basement, right? Like you still have to follow progression. You still have to make sense of the amount of reps that are being done through any one muscle group or any one movement or any one joint. You still have to account for this stuff. It's not just the wild, wild west, again, because you're in your basement. Agreed? There's no...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just trying to give people more, like, again, for people that wouldn't be used to discussing progression in training, like, again, like Jason was saying is exactly right. You start with very little loading in terms of like, if you want to get into broad jumps, you would go, okay, well, I don't know how to land first, so I have to incorporate that. And let's just say you don't ever do any form of box jumps, then you'd also want to do the other end. You want to jump, but you want to land on a higher surface. So you're jumping up to it and you're landing. So the loading of being as you absorb your load on top of the box or on top of the stair is very low. Can you hear Alice? Is that what you're looking at? Can you hear her crying? Or not crying, yelling. We're good parents. We're really good. Yeah, okay. So I think we're okay with that. So then the next part would be, so that's the limited training scenario. To recap, you're likely going to lose your training volume should probably go down initially, or should have gone down. You don't want to fill the usual amount of time you have with just crap. And then you want to obviously progress things logically as you would, or as you should be doing, and you should have been doing prior to this, and you should do after it. If you are going to add in plyometrics, you need to be very smart about it. And you need to account for how much work you're doing, and you also need to account for progressions. You likely are going to lose some muscle mass, and you likely, I guess the last part would be you're going to lose resiliency in a lot of different areas that you're probably not going to be aware of until you go back to the gym, which is the next part of the podcast. So we talk about returning to normal. So after everyone can return back to normal life, whenever that is, 2022, 2023, something like that, what's some things that we would want to discuss? And the first thing we brought up in our little note-taking is kind of like a reload. So you would have a short period, could be 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to get your body and your body parts kind of used to where you left off back in, early March type thing. So what does that look like? And what do we mean by that?
Well, the loading just has to be very light to moderate, I guess, initially, and it just has to be progressed in a very smart fashion. So you'd probably be looking at like a 2 or 3 week reload to get. So use the example of squatting to get your spine used to having load on your back or in the front rack. You don't want to just go back in there and throw on your previous 5 rep max on a back squat and try and match it when you haven't done any spinal loading over the last however long at this point, 5+ weeks and potentially 2-3 months where you haven't had a bar on your back. So there's obviously going to be some atrophy and some strength loss, like you said, in with regards to the spine. You don't want to mess around with that if you haven't done any spinal loading. And in terms of gymnastics, like if you don't have the ability to do any gymnastics or to the adequate levels you were doing before, then you got to take that into consideration in terms of, one, your hands will take a beating if you're doing any sort of bar work and pulling work, and two, just the sheer amount of volume. You can't just jump back in with that either. To do the the pre-COVID volume you were doing before, you're going to end up potentially getting yourself into an injurious position, whether it's shoulder related or just muscle related, soft tissue related. So you have to just really kind of slow the ramp up, start very light, moderate with volume, with load, and take 2 or 3 weeks to kind of progress your way through that, and know that by the end of those 2 or 3 weeks you're probably still not going to be where you were when you left off, obviously, but now you can actually start adding in some more load and a little bit more intensity in a safer setting.
Can't wait for all the Instagram posts of the post-COVID PRs.
Seriously, that's definitely going to be a thing.
Yeah, post-COVID PR.
Any thoughts, Tom, on that?
For me? Is that
what do you think?
said? Yeah, I mean, I just think the same thing that Scott had mentioned before, but it's like if you're doing burpees and air squats, you're not going to want to go in and do a workout of ring muscle ups like 30 per time or something like that. Or even like some people who are in the beginner phases of skills or intermediate phases of skills, they might find it a bit frustrating at first because there might be even some like regression in the level that they were at. If someone was just doing like 3 kipping pull-ups, you're going to have to go back to starting with swings and that kind of thing. And that might be frustrating. So taking it slow and being patient.
I think it's pretty simple for us if we're working with people who have planned deloads or unplanned deloads all the time. As long as we can go through this progression over and over and over again. Someone comes back from a surgery, like it takes a while to get back to even the starting point of a progression. Or someone has a low back tweak that has nothing to do with training, that happens at work. You're not going to go back to normal loading in the gym. It's just one of those things that is built into how you look at training. From an athlete perspective, you may not necessarily make that connection, especially if you've been training at home. But I'd guarantee, even if you have a sick ass home gym, Your training
Yeah.
intensity and volume is not what it was. Because just the psychological impact of being in a different environment, being out of routine. When you hit your workouts, you're not hitting it at the same intensity as you are when you're surrounded by the people that you're usually training with, the social aspect that pushes you farther and faster. If you don't have that for 5 weeks or 2 months, you're detrained. So you have to take the time to build back up. It's just
And
trying to be aware of it is tough.
And then what Jay was saying with regards to potentially just either on like subconsciously slowing down or just knowingly slowing down, and not trying as hard for whatever reason, just because of situation stuff. You're lifting on your own, your basement. So you have a great gym, and you're probably still going to have some limitations if you're training down there by yourself. And then the other person, like I said, if the person with just dumbbells and that's it, they're like, they may think they may be trying as hard as they can in what they're doing, but the actual stimulus on the body is going to be much lower, just because the loading is going to be a lot less, and basically the intensity potential of the movements are going to be a lot less if the training is done well. Like you can't just, again, because you have to balance this ability to create a training effect, maintain physical characteristics best you can, while not just adding up reps and overloading or just overdoing repetition, and overusing certain areas for no benefit. Kind of like, why did you do 400 air squats when the effective dose was 150? Why did you do the other 250? There was no reason to do that.
My nightmare scenario is athletes going back who have been doing home workouts, and they get a prescribed workout that is the beginning of a progression, and they're working out in a CrossFit gym, and they see the class doing something, and they jump in on that after their workout.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm afraid of that, because I'm like, you can't, not yet. Like, though everyone in that class workout may be extremely sore, and I'll be unable to go up and down stairs for 2 weeks after that. Right? Like, you don't.
But they only train 2 days a week, so it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's another great point, Jay. Like, again, if you are that class person, you're not this person we were talking about with your dumbbells in your basement, or maybe you are. You go back to a class, and still would apply to the advanced athlete. Your brain is still tuned to be who you were before. So when you go back into those movements, you may perceive and feel that this is what you should be doing and how you're going to be doing it. But you're just going to be biting off way more than you can chew initially. You're going to get going and go, wow, I'm absolutely mangled. Like, because you don't have, like, there's a lot of characteristics that are not being trained at home, and they were almost not even being maintained, but you're just trying to do the best you can. So you want to come in and slowly ramp things up over the course of a few weeks and make it safe and as effective as possible, and move forward from there. Yeah, pretty good. The other one, anything else to add with that? Or is that it? What time are we at? We're about 30 minutes.